Probably a much more recognizable stereotype in contemporary America is Asian Americans as a model minority. The basic characteristics of the model minority stereotype is that Asians are high-achieving, academically gifted, diligent, and they tend to have a passive temperament. This seems like a big 180 from the yellow peril stereotype, and that's because it is. It's the exact opposite. Instead of making Asians seem evil and threatening, the objective of this stereotype is to make them as non-threatening as possible. This is actually super fascinating. So basically, the racialization of Asian Americans has shifted throughout history depending on the various foreign and domestic circumstances. So if Asians pose a threat to white supremacy, then we get some variation of the yellow peril treatment. If Asian compliance can support white supremacy or work for national foreign interests, the stereotypes will change to be more benign, and it flips back and forth between good and bad, because Asians don't really have a permanent role in American ideology. The model minority stereotype is the most recent example of this, and it's the basis for most of the depictions of Asians in today's media, which I'll talk about in the next video. So while many of these stereotypes are positive stereotypes in a sense, they're still fundamentally dehumanizing, and more importantly, they serve the functional purpose of keeping people of color in their place. This contradictory dichotomy of racial images isn't unique to Asian people. For every race, there's a good, non-threatening stereotype to contrast with the portrayal of those people as threatening or dangerous. Like, the Uncle Tom character is very different from the more shady portrayals of blacks that emerged afterwards, because those stereotypes had very different functional purposes, but they both serve to propagate institutional racism. So, first of all, the model minority myth is disingenuous. The original myth was based off the sampling of very specific, relatively successful East Asian groups at a time when Asian immigration was essentially limited to the very highly educated Asians. So this masks the true status of racial minorities in the country. For example, only 12 to 13% of Hmong, Cambodian, and Laotian Americans who are subsumed into the racial category of Asian have a college degree. But because the model minority myth assumes all Asians are successful, they aren't represented by policymakers and they don't receive adequate social aid. Furthermore, Asian Americans require more education in order to receive the same salary as a white person would receive, and there's evidence of a bamboo ceiling that bars Asians from top-level executive and decision-making positions, which effectively limits our representation. Again, the model minority myth prevents any social progress because the assumption is Asian Americans are already successful. So these sorts of things prevent Asian Americans from achieving true equality with whites. The historical explanation as to how the model minority stereotype came to be today are actually really complicated, and there's a book that goes into more of the details called The Color of Success by Ellen D. Wu, which I won't discuss in this video for the sake of time, so instead I have a brief summary put into the video description. Basically what happened is various global political forces and changing domestic interests led to changes in the U.S. immigration policy via the Immigration Act of 1965, where restrictions against East Asians were relaxed and Chinese, Japanese, and Korean immigrants could come to the United States under a quota system. Now, one of the issues with this was that it heavily favored immigrants who were already well off, educated, or were coming to America to seek education, which of course inflated median income, education level, lowered crime rate statistics, all of which are cited as the statistical proof of the model minority status. The mainstream media picked up on these trends and used them to create a narrative of upward social mobility, and by the mid-60s, the model minority myth really hit full stride, with the New York Times Magazine's U.S. News and World Report and Time Magazine publishing articles with titles like Success Story of One Minority Group in the U.S., Chinatown Offers Us a Lesson, Asian American Whiz Kids, Success Story, Japanese American Style. These articles, combined with a tendency to undercount poor Asian Americans in the census, exaggerated the success of Asian Americans and effectively created the modern model minority myth. Incidentally, these articles started popping up right around when the civil rights movement was going on, so if we want to get cynical about this, which we will because this is Saw, the new stereotype of Asian Americans was used by white America as a rhetorical weapon against the problem minorities, with the implication being, Asian Americans made it in this country despite their history of oppression, so why can't you? This is a classic example of using the divide and conquer strategy to reinforce white supremacy by picking one minority to elevate over the rest and kind of hold their successes against other minorities, while also remaining blameless for the plight of those problem minorities. It's a strategy being employed even to this day because the myth of the model minority has proliferated so much since then and can still serve to validate racism against black people and divide people of color.
Talking Points does not believe in white privilege. However, there is no question that African Americans have a much harder time succeeding in our society than whites do. But the primary reason is not skin color, it's education, and not only book learning. Here are the facts. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the unemployment rate for black Americans is 11.4%. It's just over 5% for whites, 4.5% for Asians. So, do we have Asian privilege in America? Because the truth is that Asian American households earn far more money than anyone else.
But for Asian Americans, the model minority stereotype was and still is a huge improvement over the alternative of being demonized or marginalized. And when the stereotype first emerged, most Asian Americans chose to embrace it. And we did benefit from this stereotype significantly as a race, to the point where we can even call it a racial privilege. East Asians are not subject to the regular police harassment, and are not usually shot to death for no reason, tend not to face the same kind of overt discrimination as blacks or Hispanics. And this is actually a part of the problem, because a lot of Asian Americans, especially those who don't know our history, legitimately believe that Asians were successful in this country because we were culturally superior. Many of us have this sense of pride and security in our model minority status, so we'll actually perpetuate this myth and hold it against other people of color for not having the same success that we do. And we don't speak out on race issues because we feel that they aren't our problem. And that's the worst thing we could possibly do for racial equality in this country. As an Asian American, it should be a top priority to dismantle the model minority myth, not just for the sake of race relations, but because the stereotype is fundamentally dehumanizing and harmful to our personal and group identities. No one should be judged by how we do or do not conform to racial stereotypes. Our status as minorities puts us in kind of a middle ground between blacks and whites, and gives us a platform to speak up on race issues that those races don't have. But in order to do that, we have to understand our context as a people living in this nation and be sensitive to injustice, whether it's directed at us or others. If we continue to live under the model minority myth without resisting it, we're not only upholding institutional racism, we're also being super ignorant.